The .NET developer has two choices for building standalone desktop applications. The time-tested Windows Forms API is a popular choice, but it is outdated and surpassed by newer technologies. Then there is the Windows Presentation Foundation, a modern, DirectX-based UI system that is the perfect choice for building powerful desktop applications or the front end for your next tool or test harness. Both systems are based on the concept of a Windows-based UI, a control-based system for defining application UI, and an event-driven model where your code runs when certain events are triggered by the user or by the computer system. In this video, I'll show you a few tips that help you debug event-driven systems. To do that, I'll use several projects. I have the Pixelsmith project, which is a C# WPF application. I have the Pixelsmith WinForms application, which is a C# Windows Forms application. And finally, I have a Windows Forms application down here written in Visual Basic. I'll start with this Pixelsmith app. It's already my startup project, but if you don't see it that way on your machine, just use set as startup project. And then I'll debug my application. This is a picture editing application. I'm working on creating a crosshair that moves across the screen when I move my mouse, like this. Unfortunately, there's a bug in my code. You can see it. The red line that moves from the left to the right is not positioned correctly. It should go from the edge of the picture to the other edge of the picture, but it's starting on the edge of the window. So I need to debug this. Since this is an event-driven system, the code that I've written is in the mouse move event. Whenever the mouse moves, I determine where the mouse pointer is, and then I draw a line that intersects that point. So I'd like to debug this. So the way I would do that is I would return back to Visual Studio, open up this main window.xaml file, and then open up this C# file that's affiliated with it. It's called a code behind file. And then I would put the breakpoint in this main image underscore mouse move handler. You see what I'm doing in here is I'm using this mouse event args. When you're working in an event-driven system, you typically get some extra information passed into your event. Usually it's the sender of the event and some extra arguments. In this case, it's the mouse event args. And if I press F12 while I'm looking at this, I can see what that mouse event args consists of. There's some button information, there's some stylus information, and there's a method called getPosition. So that's what I'm using. I'm using getPosition relative to the main image, and I'm getting the X and Y coordinates, and then I'm outputting that text at the bottom of the screen. And then I'm doing some other manipulation here where I'm drawing the lines. So I'd like to put a breakpoint in here. I'll do that. I'll put a breakpoint right here by pressing F9. Then I'll return back to the application. And you see that as soon as I try to return back to the application, my breakpoint was hit. So it looks like my mouse is moving inadvertently when I switch back to that UI. That's not very helpful. I didn't even get a chance to move the mouse. So I'll press F5 again and try to be a little more careful. It's still hitting my breakpoint. Now, as soon as I move my mouse 1 pixel in any direction, it fires that event. That's great. My breakpoint is working, but it's firing too often. I'd like to look at it at intervals or dump the information out to a text window. So let me remove this. And one of the techniques you can do is you can add a breakpoint, right-click on it, and set some conditions. So I can say that this breakpoint's only hit every so many pixels when I move. Let's say every 80 pixels. So I'll choose hit count is a multiple of 80. Close this window and then continue. And now I can move my mouse around for a few minutes or a few seconds, I should say. And then after it moves 80 pixels, it hits my breakpoint. I can look at my code and then click on continue, continue and investigate what the problem is, and hit my breakpoint again. That's one way of handling this problem. Another way of handling the problem is by using something that used to be called a trace point. Here's one down here. They're now called action breakpoints. And what I've said here is I want to log a message to the output window. And the message that I'm logging is I'm calling that getPosition and outputting the X position. Now I can add some extra explanatory text here, like that. And then I'll close this. And now when I run this, and look at my output window, you'll see as I move my mouse on the screen, I'm getting this trace output into the output window. So again, I'm not interrupting the flow of my application by hitting my breakpoint all the time, but I'm still being able to see the information that's useful for me during this debugging session. So I'll close that application. Now the Windows Forms application works similarly. It has a form over here that has a picture box on it, and it has some code in the code behind. Here it is, in the code behind. It's slightly different code. What I'm doing here is I'm listening for the mouse move event, and then I'm grabbing the information from the mouse event args. It's a different class. If I press F12, you'll see it's not quite the same class that we had when I was in WPF. This one has an X and Y coordinates. I don't have to call the get position method. It also has something called clicks, which represents the number of clicks that I've clicked on the mouse button. So what I'm doing here is gathering up that information, storing it in this class level variable, and then the way you draw lines in Windows Forms is by invalidating the picture box, which causes Windows Forms to repaint it, which causes this event to fire. And then I check to see if there's a crosshair turned on in my menus, and if it is, then I draw the image down here. So I can put a breakpoint in here just like I did in the WPF application. Then I'll make this my startup project. Debug my application. See, it's hitting my breakpoint. Press F5. Hitting my breakpoint again. I'm running into the same issues I ran into in the WPF application. So I need to use the same techniques. Use an action point or one of those things. I'll just go ahead and remove it. You don't see the crosshairs because I have to turn on this show crosshair. Now they appear. And then later I can come up here and click on show crosshair to make them disappear. So that's your basics. There's one other technique you might want to use when you're debugging a Windows application. A lot of times your applications consist of many windows. And the user will start in a big application like this, and then they might do something like this and go to the About screen. And that's a separate window. And then maybe from this window, they click on a button or do something and they move into a third window. So the user is moving through your application to different locations. And as you're debugging, you may not want to go through all those steps of opening those windows and clicking through to get to the form that you want to debug. For instance, if I want to check something out on this button, maybe this OK button's not working correctly. So rather than having to go into Help, About to debug it, I just like to have the About form be the startup object. In a Windows Form application, you change the startup by going to, if it's a C# application, you go to program.cs, and then you type in the new name here. So I would type in the class name here, and that causes that About form to show up. If you're in a Visual Basic project, go to this My Project, then you can click from this drop-down. I have 3 forms available in this project, so I can pick any of these items. So I'll pick Splash Screen and make this my startup. This shows my splash screen. And then I would have to have some code here that would then switch over to the other form. And if you're in a WPF project, the way you set your startup is to go to this file, app.xaml. I'll show you this About view. This is one I'll show in the WPF application. So I'll go back to app.xaml and I'll type in About view. And then I'll make this my startup project and choose Start Debugging. So there's my About screen for this application. And as you can see, it's a nice looking window. But the point here is, again, I get to test it out without having to start up the main window.